Um, so first, I've been reading the chats and everything that people are writing. I can tell we have lots of different people in different roles. So I think I'm going to direct my comments more to those of you that are working in schools, in districts, or at SEAs versus researchers or those who are analyzing this information for other purposes. I think one of the things that both Anthony and Trevor have brought up is the importance of really understanding what your data has and what kinds of meaning you can make from it. Our experience in Vermont is that every question that we ask of the data, it leads to another question. So Ricky, you asked, how long does this whole process take from when you start cleaning the data to when you analyze it and you have a report? And my answer is it never ends. And I'm positive that's not what you hope to hear, but when we start with a research question, we can usually come up with an answer to the first question pretty quickly after we've done some cleaning. But it always leads to a, well, what about this, and how about if we look at it this way, and what if we do this other cross-tab of some kind? So what we have found is once we started down the path of analyzing the data, it's actually fairly open-ended. And so I think my advice to you, for those of you that are working in the field, is to really think about what your capacity is for action for the research question that you're going to ask. You don't have unlimited time and energy, and so you have to really focus your efforts on the best places to work towards improvement. So in Vermont, we use this data primarily to understand the context of exclusionary discipline in our state. And we've been thinking carefully about the policy considerations that we have. So I think one of the questions that came up from Clara was about, like, how do you define what's extremely high? And we didn't know when we started out what would be an extremely high disproportionate level for any student group. And so we had to first look at the data and then say, you know what, among some of our schools, there's a disproportionality rate that's 2 or 3 times exclusionary rates for students with disabilities or students on free and reduced lunch to others. That's where we need to focus our attention. But there were other places where it was 1.5 times, and that was equally troubling. But we had to triage our efforts and decide where to support folks. So I don't know if that's helpful. Excuse me. Also, Jessica, you raised a question about how small is too small. Well, every state and every district should have guidelines for you related to how you protect student privacy related to FERPA. In Vermont, we use a minimum N of 11 for reporting any data. Our schools are incredibly small and our diversity is not very high. This means that in many of our reports, we end up suppressing data. And I will make sure to send to the REL a link to our Vermont discipline report for those of you who'd like to see what that suppressed data looks like in action. But then the last thing I think that's really important is before you sit down to look at this data is to think about what are you going to do with your data once you get it. And in most cases, if you're at a district level or a school level, the data you're using is likely not the civil rights data collection. It's some kind of data collection tool that you have for collecting the information about exclusions or any kind of discipline. I think one of the very first questions you want to ask yourself is, what kind of data and guidance have you given to your folks who do the data entry to know whether or not you're capturing all disciplinary actions, or is it just when a student is suspended? So in my state, we've only required that school districts put in data when the student misses school. We don't require it when they decide on some other consequence. So I can't actually ever tell someone if kids are getting suspended more frequently than they're not getting suspended, because quite frankly, I don't know anything about the times they've committed an infraction and didn't get suspended. I only know for certain when they have. So you just have to be really careful with that. And what we found related to what Trevor was speaking about in cleaning the data is we had a lot of errors in data entry that we only discovered because we were doing our reports. So for example, one of the things that we discovered is the vast majority of our suspensions were for something called violating school rules. Well, we found out after we sat down with our school folks The reason why that was happening was for 3 reasons. One, it was the very first thing they saw, so they didn't do a drop-down menu to look at all the choices. The second is that they liked it because they could fill in text describing what happened, and the other choices didn't let them fill in any other text. So we changed the way the data collection tool works so that you can actually enter in data. And we changed the first thing you see literally to murder, which is a suspendable offense, not something you think about every day. But that's so rare that it forced people to open up the menu and see all of the other choices. And then the third thing that happened was what Trevor was referencing is that when there are multiple infractions related to a single incident, the school folks were having a hard time deciding. So a student has had a fight, they have a weapon, and they're also caught with drugs, and they intimidate a witness. They chose violate school rules because all 4 of those things violate school rules. It seemed like a good choice. But what we said was, no, actually, what's the precipitating reason that you are suspending the student? Select that one and then use that from there. So we provided additional training. Then the last thing that I would say is, I think that if your goal is to help people improve their discipline at their school so that you have support for a healthy learning environment, but also reduce any kind of impact of implicit bias or racism or sexism to others, you need to really balance how you look at the data. Jawan's been chatting a bit about the concern that sometimes schools stop suspending students because they're worried about what the statistics will look like, but it's actually leading to a disruption in school climate. Super important that as you're working with your schools, with your principals, your assistant principals, whoever is responsible for these decisions, that you're maintaining the obligation of the school to both provide a supportive learning environment for all kids, but also really address the ways in which they may be doing this disproportionately and in ways that harm kids.